The suburban neighborhood stood still under the weight of an early morning sun, its streets quiet, save for the occasional chirp of birds or the hum of a distant lawnmower. On the surface, it was the kind of place where everyone kept to their own business, where the grass was always perfectly manicured, and the sound of children laughing echoed across pristine lawns. But behind the neat hedges and freshly painted fences, there were cracks in the facade, small but telling. One of those cracks was Karen, a self-appointed queen of the HOA who wielded her power like a sledgehammer, always ready to tear down anything that didn't fit her narrow vision of perfection. From a distance, she stood on the sidewalk, hands on her hips, glaring at the front yard of a modest home. The garden, though full of life, was slightly untamed, the plants a little too wild for Karen's liking. It wasn't the first time she'd paid a visit to the elderly couple living there, but today, the tension felt different. Her sharp words cut through the air, and her laugh carried a bitter edge. "I told you last week, didn't I?" Karen's voice echoed like the sound of nails on a chalkboard. "How many times do I have to tell you that this isn't a garden, it's a mess? People might start thinking this neighborhood is full of people who can't even take care of their own property." The elderly couple, both of whom were blind, stood in their yard, unaware of Karen's growing fury. The husband, a stoic man in his late 70s, adjusted his cane, trying to find his way to the garden's edge. His wife, her fingers trembling as she held a small watering can, was doing her best to help him navigate the space. Karen's voice grew louder, taunting them. "Honestly, you two are lucky I'm even here to remind you. If I didn't know better, I'd say you can't even see how much this is dragging down property values." She sneered, snapping a photo of the disaster. The protagonist, hidden in the shadows of their own home, clenched their fists, watching the scene unfold through the curtains. They had been keeping an eye on things, knowing it wouldn't be long before Karen went too far. But today felt different. The mocking tone in Karen's voice sent a chill down their spine. Their parents, kind, dignified people who had spent decades in this neighborhood, had always been victims of her relentless attacks. But the real frustration wasn't the trivial matters of overgrown plants or slightly off-kilter fences. It was the cruelty, the malicious mockery of their blindness, a disability that wasn't something to be mocked but understood. Karen had no idea what it was like to live in the world through their eyes, but that didn't stop her from making them feel small, worthless. Every part of the protagonist being wanted to step outside, to confront Karen, to defend their family. But something held them back. They were watching from the shadows, biding their time. The quiet intensity of the moment wasn't lost on them. This was no longer just about the garden. This was personal. And that's when it hit them. The only thing Karen truly feared was authority. And right now, the protagonist was the one person Karen wouldn't be able to talk her way out of. But there was no rush. The time would come. For now, they waited. But with every passing second, the tension in the air thickened, like a storm brewing just over the horizon. The question remained, how long could Karen keep pushing before she finally met someone who wouldn't back down? The mocking laugh echoed down the street, sharp and cutting. Karen stood tall, her hands on her hips, as if her every word was a decree from on high. She snapped another picture of the garden, each click of her camera like a final nail in the coffin of the elderly couple's dignity. The husband, his cane tapping the ground as he shifted, didn't seem to notice the sting in Karen's words, but the wife's face flushed with a mix of confusion and hurt. They were both too proud to let the insults show, but the tension between them was palpable. Behind the curtains, the protagonist's heart raced. They could feel the heat of anger building up, but there was something else, something sharper. It wasn't just the anger at Karen's cruelty. It was the dread, the sickening certainty that this time, something worse was coming. Karen was never just about the rules. She was about power. She didn't care if she bruised feelings or humiliated people to enforce her vision of the perfect neighborhood. It was more than just the lawn. This was an attack on their parents, on their humanity. The protagonist had watched this for far too long. But today, the stakes were higher. They could feel it in their bones. "Honestly, I don't know how you two are even managing to live here," Karen sneered, clearly enjoying the power she wielded. "It's not just your lawn. Look at this place. This isn't how normal people live, you know. There are standards to follow." The protagonist's hands tightened around the windowsill. The words were like daggers, meant to tear into the very soul of their parents. Karen wasn't just mocking them for their blindness. She was mocking their entire existence. Her contempt for them had never been so naked, so raw. And then came the final push. Karen took another step toward the couple, her voice lowering, dripping with venom. "You know, if you can't even manage something this simple, well, maybe it's time you moved out. This neighborhood's for people who can keep up. It's not a charity case." The wife's hand trembled as she lowered the watering can, her eyes glistening with unspoken hurt. The husband shifted his weight on the cane, his face unreadable, but his silence screamed louder than words. The protagonist could feel the knot in their stomach tighten. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. This was about their parents' pride, their dignity, and their peace. Every fiber of the protagonist's being screamed to rush outside, to confront Karen, to make her feel the weight of her cruelty. But they couldn't. Not yet. They were watching, waiting for the moment to strike. There was something about Karen's confidence, her sense of invulnerability, that made this confrontation different from the others. It wasn't just the need to defend their parents. It was about something much bigger, something that couldn't be fixed with a few choice words. In the stillness of that moment, the protagonist finally knew what they had to do. They had to let Karen keep going. Let her think she was untouchable. Let her believe she could trample over anyone she wanted without consequence. The protagonist's jaw clenched, eyes narrowing in resolve. The time would come when Karen would regret underestimating them. She wouldn't see it coming. Karen, oblivious to the storm that was quietly brewing behind the window, sneered one final time at the couple and snapped yet another picture. She turned to walk away, her voice ringing out over her shoulder. "Just remember, if this isn't fixed by next week, I'll be calling the HOA. You can't keep living like this." The protagonist's grip on the windowsill tightened until their knuckles were white. The air outside felt thick, suffocating, as if the very world was holding its breath. One moment of silence passed, then another. And then, without a single word, everything changed. The air between the two households hung heavy with the tension of Karen's departure. Her footsteps echoed down the sidewalk, the sound of her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown. The protagonist's eyes followed her every move, watching as she finally disappeared behind the curve of the street. The oppressive silence that followed felt like a trap, thick and suffocating. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Behind the window, the protagonist stood still, pulse pounding, every muscle locked in place. Karen had gone, but the damage had already been done. Their parents stood there, quietly absorbing the sting of her words. The protagonist's mind raced. How long had it been since they'd been this close to the edge, this close to exploding with rage? Karen had taken something from them today, something that couldn't be fixed by words. But it wasn't just the insults. It was the way she had tried to break them, to undermine everything their parents had worked so hard to build. For a fleeting moment, the protagonist considered just letting it go. Perhaps, just this once, they could let Karen have her victory. But the thought evaporated like smoke. This was no ordinary situation. The injustice, the cruelty, the way Karen had made their parents feel small. It couldn't be ignored any longer. It was time to act. And yet, the protagonist did not rush out the door. They didn't storm down the street and confront Karen in a fit of anger. Instead, they stood motionless, their heart beating louder in their chest with each passing second. They were waiting for the right moment. The moment when Karen would no longer see them as just another neighbor, a random person she could brush aside with a flick of her finger. Seconds turned into minutes, and the protagonist's grip on the windowsill tightened, the wood creaking under the pressure. They could feel their heartbeat in their throat, in their ears. But the moment didn't come. The neighborhood, as always, seemed calm on the surface. People moved in and out of their homes, walking dogs, picking up mail, and getting on with their day as if nothing had happened. It was all so ordinary, but to the protagonist, it felt like a false calm. It felt like the eye of a storm, with the tension crackling in the air, waiting for the explosion. The protagonist let out a slow breath, their eyes narrowing as they focused on the scene outside. They were waiting for something more, something deeper than just a confrontation. They were waiting for Karen's mistake to reveal itself. And then, like a jolt of electricity, the protagonist's instincts kicked in. The old couple, who had stood there quietly for so long, began to move. The wife slowly walked over to the husband, guiding him with gentle care, their hands brushing as they made their way to the porch. The soft clink of the door as they closed it behind them felt like the sound of a distant bell tolling. The protagonist watched them with a growing sense of unease, as if they could sense the shift in the air. Karen's insults had torn something open, and now it was up to the protagonist to close it. But the question lingered. Could they do it without losing themselves to the same venom that had fueled Karen's cruelty? The stillness outside was suddenly broken by a car engine starting up, a loud, rumbling sound that shook the ground, but it was not Karen's car. This time, it was the protagonist's vehicle. They had made their decision. With a cold resolve, the protagonist turned from the window, walked toward the door, and pulled it open. The cool breeze brushed against their face, and with every step toward the driveway, they felt the weight of what was coming. The time had come to make Karen understand, and she wouldn't see it coming. The protagonist's heart pounded in their chest as they approached the car, the engine's hum beneath their fingertips as their mind raced. They hadn't planned to confront Karen this way, hadn't intended to reveal their hand just yet, but something in the air had shifted. The calm was gone, and in its place, a simmering intensity, a silent promise that things wouldn't be the same after today. Karen's taunts echoed in the protagonist's mind, each word like a poison dripping in their veins. The insult wasn't just against their parents, it was an attack on everything they'd fought to protect. The anger had been building, coiling tighter and tighter inside them. But it wasn't just rage anymore, it was justice. It was the moment where everything, every cruel word Karen had ever spoken, was about to be undone in an instant. As the protagonist slid into the driver's seat, they could feel the weight of the decision settling around them. This wasn't just about a neighbor who went too far. This was about standing up, about showing Karen, and everyone else, who was really in charge. The engine roared to life, the tires gripping the asphalt as they backed out of the driveway. The neighborhood that had once felt peaceful now felt eerily quiet, almost as if the entire world were holding its breath. The air felt charged, thick with anticipation. Karen was still out there, likely still basking in the aftermath of her cruel little conquest, unaware that the tables were about to turn. The car sped down the street, each turn bringing them closer to Karen's house. The protagonist's grip tightened on the wheel as their gaze narrowed in on the road ahead. They knew exactly where Karen would be, standing in her yard, self-righteously inspecting her kingdom, oblivious to the storm gathering in her wake. As the car neared Karen's house, the protagonist's chest tightened. They didn't want to think about what would happen next. All they could focus on was the goal, to make Karen understand the price of her arrogance. And then they saw her. There she was, standing at the edge of her property, hands on her hips, staring down at the world as if she owned it. Karen's voice rang out in the distance, but the words were lost in the rush of blood pounding in the protagonist's ears. The car came to a screeching halt, tires skidding slightly on the gravel as it jerked to a stop in front of Karen. She turned, startled, her eyes narrowing, as she registered who was sitting behind the wheel. The protagonist didn't give her a chance to speak. "You've crossed a line," they said, voice steady, but cutting through the air like a blade. Karen blinked, her confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake innocence, the kind of tone that had worked for her on so many others. But this wasn't some unsuspecting neighbor. This was someone who had seen through her charade, someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The protagonist slowly stepped out of the car, their eyes locked on Karen. They didn't have to introduce themselves. Karen's expression changed in an instant, her smirk fading into a frown of recognition. "Do you know who I am?" the protagonist asked, their tone deliberate. Karen's eyes narrowed even further. "What's this? Some sort of?" "I'm the police chief," the protagonist interrupted, voice hard, unyielding. "And I've been watching you." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Karen's face drained of color as the realization dawned on her. This wasn't just some random neighbor. This wasn't someone she could walk all over. This was a person with power, someone who had the authority to expose her for what she truly was. For the first time, Karen's confidence cracked. The towering facade she had built, brick by brick, crumbled in a matter of seconds. Her mouth opened and closed as she tried to speak, to defend herself, but no words came. The protagonist stepped closer, their presence casting a long shadow over Karen. "You think you can humiliate people with your petty rules?" they asked, voice calm but filled with unshakable authority. "You think you can get away with it because you hold a title that means nothing?" "Not anymore." Karen swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling with quick breaths, eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. But the protagonist's gaze was unwavering, cold, and unrelenting. They had the upper hand now, and Karen, finally, couldn't talk her way out of this. The moment hung in the air like a charged wire, buzzing with electricity. Karen stood frozen, her eyes locked on the protagonist, her mouth still open in an unspoken gasp. The truth had shattered her, and for the first time, she was no longer the one in control. Her hands trembled at her sides as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The protagonist, standing tall with their arms crossed, let the silence stretch on for a few agonizing seconds. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the street, but none of it mattered now. The world had narrowed down to this singular confrontation, this one moment of reckoning. "You," Karen finally managed to sputter, her voice faltering. You're the police chief." The protagonist didn't answer immediately. Instead, they let the weight of their presence hang in the air, their eyes locking onto Karen's with a chilling steadiness. Karen's expression shifted from disbelief to panic, her mind scrambling to piece together a defense. Anything that could reverse the tide, anything that could save her from the consequences she knew were looming. "I know you've been harassing my parents for months," the protagonist continued, voice cold but deliberate. "Insulting them, mocking them, all because they don't fit into your perfect little world. You thought you could get away with it because they're vulnerable." Karen took a hesitant step back, her eyes darting to the ground before meeting the protagonist's gaze again. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She was struggling to maintain the dominant persona she had carefully constructed for years, but now it was slipping through her fingers, unraveling at the seams. The protagonist took a step forward, their voice dropping lower, more threatening. "You thought you could bully them. You thought you could walk all over them without anyone saying anything." They paused, letting the weight of their words sink in. "But I'm not just anyone." A shudder ran through Karen's body. She swallowed hard, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Her eyes flicked to the side, searching for something, anything, to cling to, but the protagonist's presence had consumed all of her escape routes. "I'll fix this," she finally blurted out, her words strained. But she was cut off before she could finish. "You're done here," the protagonist interjected firmly, their gaze unyielding. "And not just with my parents. The entire neighborhood has had enough of your games." Karen's face paled, and the color drained from her cheeks as the reality set in. The protagonist wasn't going to back down. No amount of charm or manipulation was going to save her now. She could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting, as the enormity of the situation crashed over her. "I don't," Karen started, panic rising in her voice. "I'm giving you one chance," the protagonist continued, their voice low, cutting through Karen's frantic pleas. "One chance to walk away from this. Walk away from the neighborhood, from the HOA, from everything, or I make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." The threat hung in the air, undeniable, its implications clear. Karen had made her enemies here, and now the full force of the protagonist's authority was closing in on her. The power she had once wielded with impunity was no longer hers to command. For a moment, Karen stood there, her body frozen in place, her mind racing for a way out. But she knew, deep down, there was no escape. The protagonist wasn't just another homeowner she could manipulate. They were the law. And that was a truth she could no longer ignore. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Every passing second felt like a slow, deliberate countdown to Karen's inevitable fall from grace. And then, in one final, desperate move, Karen's defiance crumbled. "I'll leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but there was no mistaking the fear behind it. "I'll leave the HOA. I'll stop. Just, please don't do anything more." The protagonist didn't answer at first. Instead, they watched her, eyes unblinking, as Karen's confidence continued to wither away. It was as if the universe had conspired to break her. The grandiosity of her control, the smugness in her every step. Now, it was gone, replaced by a broken woman who had no idea how to fix the mess she had made. With a single nod, the protagonist turned and began to walk back toward the car, leaving Karen standing there, trembling. But they didn't need to say anything more. The message had been delivered, loud and clear. And as the protagonist drove away, they couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace wash over them. The battle wasn't just won, it was over. But as they glanced in the rearview mirror, a small, unsettling thought crept into their mind. Was this truly the end, or had they merely unleashed something even darker? The silence in the car felt like a weight, thick and suffocating. The protagonist's hands gripped the wheel tighter as they navigated the winding streets of the neighborhood, their mind racing. They had won, but the victory felt hollow, the aftertaste of confrontation still lingering in the air. It wasn't just the hollow victory over Karen, it was the realization that their parents' peace had been shattered, that the damage was deeper than just one woman's cruelty. The landscape of the neighborhood had been altered forever, and so had the protagonist's place within it. But that wasn't the only thing gnawing at the protagonist's mind. Karen's desperate plea, the way she had crumbled so easily, it didn't sit right. People like her didn't break that quickly. Something wasn't adding up. The protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden buzzing in their pocket. A text message. "Chief, we need to talk. It's about Karen." The name of the sender was all too familiar. It was Detective Mason, a trusted colleague and friend. The message was straightforward, but the urgency in the few words sent a ripple of unease through the protagonist. What had they missed? They had no intention of dealing with Karen any further. She had promised to leave the HOA, to stop her harassment. So why the sudden message? Why now? The protagonist's fingers tightened around the phone as they pulled into the driveway, heart rate quickening. Their thoughts whirled with possibilities, none of them good. As they stepped out of the car, the world outside felt eerily still. The once bustling neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, every sound more pronounced: chirping birds, distant conversations, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But none of it could drown out the buzzing anxiety in the protagonist's chest. They needed answers. Without a word, they made their way inside, checking their phone again as they entered the house. Another message. It was from Mason. "She's been running an underground scheme. The HOA wasn't her only front. You need to see this. Come to the office." A chill ran down the protagonist's spine. This wasn't just about Karen being a neighborhood nuisance anymore. This was something deeper, something more insidious. The protagonist's mind raced. How had Karen hidden her true intentions for so long? How had she kept her schemes under wraps, manipulating everyone around her? She had been ruthless, slicing through their parents' lives like a hot knife through butter. But this was different. The protagonist immediately dialed Mason's number, their finger trembling slightly on the screen as they pressed it to their ear. "Mason, what's going on? What did you find?" Their voice was low, tight with tension. Mason's voice on the other end was just as grave. "It's bigger than you think. Karen has been collecting personal information from every HOA resident for months. She's been blackmailing them for money, threatening to expose their secrets unless they pay her. And that's just the tip of the iceberg." The protagonist's blood ran cold as they listened. The woman they had just exposed, who had crumbled at the first sign of opposition, was not who she seemed. And the worst part, Mason continued, his voice growing darker, "She's been working with someone else. A bigger player. I think you know who." The words hit like a punch to the gut. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be. But deep down, the protagonist already knew. The truth had been hiding in plain sight, buried under layers of deceit and manipulation. Karen wasn't working alone. Before they could respond, Mason added, "You need to meet me at the office now. We don't have much time." Without another word, the protagonist ended the call, a sense of dread washing over them as they stared at the screen. This had stopped being a simple neighborhood dispute. Karen's fall from grace was just the beginning. And now, the real danger was closing in. They stepped outside once more, a new fire burning in their chest. This time, it wasn't about confronting Karen. It was about uncovering the full extent of her plans, and more importantly, exposing the shadowy figure pulling her strings. The neighborhood's peace had been shattered, but something much darker was coming. The drive to the office felt like a blur, the road a winding, unrecognizable stretch beneath the protagonist's tires. The weight of the new information, Karen's deeper involvement in a criminal scheme, the shadowy figure she was working with, pulled at the protagonist's mind, dragging them into a dark spiral of questions. Who could be behind this? And why was Karen so willing to risk everything for the power she'd been wielding? By the time they pulled into the police station's lot, the air had thickened, an ominous pressure settling over them. The tension was palpable, thick as fog, and the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that every second spent not uncovering the truth was a second closer to danger. Inside the building, Detective Mason was already waiting by the elevators, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a furrowed brow and a look that spoke volumes. He didn't greet the protagonist with his usual friendly banter. Instead, his eyes flickered over to the door, then back to them. "We don't have much time," Mason said, his voice sharp. "Karen's been getting information on a lot of people, but it's not just blackmail. She's making moves, dangerous ones." The protagonist's stomach churned. "What do you mean dangerous? What exactly is she up to?" Mason led them quickly into the office, moving with a sense of urgency that spoke volumes. He didn't waste any time sitting down, immediately pulling up a set of files on his desk, photographs, maps, and a series of notes. There, amidst the chaotic clutter, was the picture of the larger operation. Karen, a seemingly harmless neighbor, at the center of a complex web of illegal activity. She's been targeting people's homes, taking information she shouldn't. But it's not just blackmail, Chief. She's dealing with stolen goods. More specifically, stolen tech. High-level, corporate-level tech. The protagonist's blood ran cold. "Are you telling me she's been smuggling tech out of these homes?" Mason nodded grimly, flipping through more documents. "Not just that. She's been stealing corporate secrets, siphoning off data, using this HOA network to track the tech moguls and corporate execs in the area. Then she sells it to the highest bidder." The enormity of it all hit the protagonist like a tidal wave. Karen, a neighborhood Karen, was part of a vast underground operation, smuggling corporate secrets, stealing tech, and manipulating people in ways that defied belief. But there was something even worse lurking beneath the surface. A bigger player, someone else pulling the strings. There's someone higher up, someone who's been helping her, Mason continued, voice low. And I think we both know who that is. The name hung in the air like a curse. The protagonist didn't need to hear it. They already knew. But the twist was worse than they could have imagined. This shadowy figure wasn't just any criminal mastermind. It was someone close to them, someone with connections in law enforcement, someone they had trusted. I've been digging, Mason said, voice dropping. And I found something. Someone in the department's been feeding her information, covering her tracks, making sure we never connected the dots. This goes deeper than just Karen and her petty HOA games. The protagonist's thoughts whirled as the realization hit. The betrayal, the sense of violation. It wasn't just about Karen's crimes. It was about the fact that someone they had trusted had turned against them, had been working with Karen all along. The lines of loyalty, of trust, were blurring, and the danger was now much closer than it had ever been. The room seemed to close in on the protagonist. They stood there for a moment, processing what they had just heard. The reality of the situation was so much bigger than a neighborhood dispute, so much darker. And yet it felt like it was all connected. Karen's petty cruelty, the thefts, the secrets, and now the police department's own corruption. We need to act, and we need to do it fast, the protagonist said, their voice cold and steely. If Karen's involved in this, and there's someone in the department helping her, we have to shut it down before it spreads any further. Mason gave a stiff nod, his eyes narrowing. I've already begun the process. We'll need backup, and we need to be careful. Whoever is behind this won't go down easily. This isn't just about blackmail anymore. This is something much bigger. The protagonist turned toward the door, their heart pounding. The weight of everything crashing down on them made their vision blur. But one thought burned bright through the haze. This wasn't just about exposing Karen anymore. This was about saving everything they'd built, protecting their family and their city from a threat that had now found its way into the very heart of the department. And they weren't going to let that happen. The moment the door to the office slammed shut behind the protagonist, the weight of their next steps hit them like a ton of bricks. The walls around them seemed to close in, the entire situation spiraling beyond control. Karen's crimes were far worse than they'd ever imagined, and now the police department itself had been infiltrated by a traitor. The question burned in the protagonist's mind like a wildfire. Who could they trust? Mason's words echoed in their head. This isn't just about Karen anymore. The realization sank in deeper as the protagonist's fingers brushed the edges of their phone. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was systemic, and whoever was behind this, whoever had been feeding information to Karen, was still out there. They had to act. The protagonist's feet moved instinctively, heading toward the squad cars parked outside. Mason was already there, waiting, his face tight with concern. We've got one shot at this, Mason said, his voice low, urgent. If we're going to take down Karen and whoever else is involved, we need to hit her hard now. The protagonist nodded grimly, their eyes scanning the area. They knew time was running out, and Karen's web of deceit was unraveling faster than they could keep up with. But they also knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't go down without a fight. The drive to Karen's house felt like an eternity, the road stretching out before them, dark and empty. The protagonist's thoughts were consumed by the unknowns. Who could they really trust in the department? And more pressing, what would happen when they confronted Karen this time? As they neared the familiar block, the lights of Karen's house flickered in the distance, casting an eerie glow on the quiet street. But something was different tonight. There was no sign of Karen standing in her yard, no smug look on her face, no air of superiority. The house sat eerily still, and the tension in the air felt like it was about to snap. They pulled into the driveway, Mason's car behind them. The team moved quickly, silently, slipping out of the vehicles, ready for whatever came next. But the closer they got to the front door, the more something didn't feel right. The protagonist's hand reached for their gun. Something wasn't adding up. Where was Karen? Mason signaled the team to fan out as the protagonist approached the door. The heavy knock echoed through the silence, but no answer came. The door was slightly ajar, a chilling sight in the otherwise still night. Without hesitation, the protagonist kicked the door open, the sound of splintering wood ringing out in the quiet air. Inside, the house was dark. Only the faint glow of a single lamp illuminating the living room. The stench of stale air hit them like a wall. Karen. The protagonist's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. It's over. No answer. But then, a movement. The protagonist's eyes narrowed as they scanned the room, their heart rate spiking. Then, a shadow darted across the hallway. A figure. Stop, the protagonist shouted, moving quickly toward the sound. They rounded the corner just in time to see a figure slip into a back room. It was Karen, but there was something different about her now, something desperate in her movements. She wasn't the smug, self-assured woman she had once been. Her eyes were wide with panic, her movements erratic. The once unflappable Karen was now a woman who had realized the weight of the storm closing in on her. Karen, it's over. You're not getting away, the protagonist said, their voice steady but resolute. Karen whipped around, her face contorted in fear. But instead of the usual defiant sneer, there was only fear. You don't understand. It's not just me. You've already made a mistake. The person behind this, he'll make sure you never get out of here. The protagonist's stomach churned as Karen's words hit like a hammer. A chill ran down their spine. But before they could react, there was a loud click. A gun barrel appeared from the shadows behind Karen, pointed directly at the protagonist. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The room held its breath. Then, the voice they feared most spoke, smooth and cold. Let's not be hasty now, Chief. I think it's time you and I had a little chat. The figure stepped out from the darkness, revealing none other than the man the protagonist had trusted most, Detective Mason. A surge of disbelief hit the protagonist like a tidal wave. Mason, the man they had trusted, the man they thought was a friend, was the one behind the entire operation. He was the one pulling the strings all along. You? The protagonist's voice was barely a whisper. You've been working with her. Mason's smirk was chilling. Oh, I've been working with a lot more than just Karen. You're out of your depth, Chief. You've been blind this whole time. In that moment, everything clicked. The corruption ran deeper than they could have ever imagined. And now, with Mason's gun trained on them, it wasn't just a betrayal, it was a trap. But the protagonist wasn't done yet. They had one last move to make. With a swift motion, they knocked the gun from Mason's hand, the room erupting in chaos. And as the tension snapped, the game had changed once again.